Well, thank you very much indeed, Jenny, and thank you very much for inviting me this evening to speak to you and welcome everybody. We're going to deal with something this afternoon which personally I find absolutely fascinating and have done all my life. Just a note before we start, I'm going to be dealing with two principal things, the nature spirits, which are also known sometimes as elementals, and then a separate kingdom of nature called the Devas, which are perhaps known more widely in Christian circles as angels. So I shall use Devas and angels as a term interchangeably, and I'll use the word nature spirits and elementals interchangeably as well. So, unseen and largely unrecognized by the vast majority of people, there is a hidden commonwealth of invisible, non-human entities which create, protect, and renew all life forms in all of nature's kingdoms, and that includes the mineral kingdom. And these unseen empires are widely referred to throughout the theosophical literature, but strangely, it's an area that's not discussed that often these days. It used to be back in the early days of the Theosophical Society, it was, but it seems to be an area which has been somewhat neglected. So I think it's high time that we revive this as a topic that we speak about. Now, these kingdoms involve vast hierarchies and numerous different classes of nature spirits or elementals. And these operate, as the name suggests, in the four elements of air, earth, fire, and water. And they operate principally on the astral and etheric planes. At a higher level, there's an even more powerful creative hierarchy, and these are the Devas. The word Deva means shining one when translated from the Sanskrit. These are the angelic kingdoms who operate mainly on the mental and astral planes. The precise relationship between the nature spirits and the Devas and their very separate evolutionary strands, we have to say, is a complex one. The Devas are on an entirely different evolutionary scheme to that of humans, and are said in many cases to be far more advanced than humans, although some Devas, to complicate things, have passed through the human stage. Both of these classes are without gender, they're sexless. So the relationship between the Devas and the nature spirits is sometimes described as the Devas being the architects and the nature spirits or elementals being the builders who actually do the work. That might be a slightly oversimplistic way of looking at this, but there's much about this whole area that we don't know very much about. So the theosophical literature and many other esoteric traditions have quite a lot to say about both these classes of entities and the operations they conduct to continue their creative work. So do many religious and sacred texts as well. So, as I say, it's quite interesting that it doesn't come up as a topic for discussion very often. But nevertheless, when, if you're talking to a non-specialist audience and you start talking about elves and fairies and pixies or the numerous other names that they have in different traditions, it's always going to be extremely challenging, because, as we'll see, most people deny the existence of these entities. Now, there are numerous different descriptions of these nature spirits depending on the epoch and depending on the culture as well. Here in the UK, a couple of centuries ago, these spirits were still seen quite widely by people in country areas, where there was no electric lighting and the communications were very poor and so on. But they were often described then, back in the 18th century, as wearing the garb and the costumes of a previous era, say the Elizabethan era. And this is quite interesting. As we'll see, some of these entities by a number of writers and in a number of traditions are described often as wearing very tight-fitting one-piece bodysuits. And this is quite interesting because this is how a number of supposed extraterrestrials are described. And there may be some kind of crossover, as we'll explore, between what people perceive as extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings and this rich history in the world of people seeing these types of entities too. So some of the things that people see are always seen in the particular mode of the time. So in the past, people would have described serpents and fiery chariots and that sort of thing, because that's the way they understood these things. So let's ask ourselves, why are these two classes of mainly invisible entities so vital to us and to the world that we live in? Well, the answer is simple. It's because without these hidden hosts, there would be actually no life as we know it. These entities keep us alive, they heal disease, and they're actually, as we'll see, central to our reproduction as well. And they operate on animals, on plants, and in the mineral realms in various different degrees. They also play, I mean, certainly the Devas play a pivotal role in the weather, as well as certain planetary upheavals, such as natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and so on. So they're literally everywhere, operating in and immediately beyond our own physical bodies. They work on rocks, on minerals, metals, crystals, every living thing on the planet, in the plant and vegetable kingdom, is intimately connected with individual or collective groups of elementals. Every flower bud, every tree, every vegetable relies on these entities as its essential, if you like, construction workers to help build and preserve their forms. Animals too have their invisible helpers, to quote Charles Leadbeater's phrase, and with the nature spirits maintaining their bodies. So these hidden legions create and perpetuate all life on the planet, and the planet itself, of course, which is a living, breathing organism, and we are constituent parts of this. This is what is so interesting about Theosophy, because long before it became fashionable, Theosophy talked about the intimate interconnectedness of all life, and this is a good illustration of how that actually happens. So both angels and nature spirits feature very, very prominently in the myths, the legends, the religions, and the folklore of virtually all cultures down the ages, virtually all of them. It's hard to find actually any exception to this at any time in history, or indeed any part of the world, until now. For the first time in history, we're living in a world which actually denies the existence of these. So they're largely forgotten. They've been banished by supposed rationality and by the hard logic of modernism and by the deep cynicism which tends to result from these points of view. And in recent centuries, these hierarchies have been squeezed even further from view and made even more invisible by the domination of materialism and the relentless process of industrialization of one sort or another. Another factor is that we've seen over the last 100 to 200 years in most countries, mass migrations from the country to much larger cities, usually for economic reasons. And this has had the effect of tending to disconnect people from nature and the natural world. So if you talk to people in the UK or Europe or industrialized, westernized countries, they're seen really as just the crude superstitions of our supposedly primitive ancestors. And they're now completely ignored by the vast majority of people. And I think this is a somewhat arrogant attitude to have, but that's just my personal view about that. These entities, and I can't stress it strongly enough, are humanity's most vital ally. And without them, we'd be unable to live. But with the supreme hubris that we seem to have developed, we've decided that they don't exist anymore, that they can be just consigned to history. But I think in the coming decades and centuries, this is going to change. And I think it's going to change quite radically and dramatically. And I strongly believe that we're destined to rediscover and to cooperate much more closely with the inhabitants of these covert worlds, if you will. How this will happen is far from clear, but it does seem to be the case that it will. Okay, so we'll deal now more specifically with the nature spirits and elementals, look at what they do, how they've been seen, and to some extent, as far as we understand it, how they operate. So, as I said earlier on, they're linked to the four elements, and using the British nomenclature, we have the gnomes of the earth and the sylphs of the air, the undines of water, and the salamanders of fire. As I say, this is mainly a Western classification, and there are numerous, hundreds, thousands of other ways of classing them and categorizing them regarding where you are in the world. Throughout the world history, nature spirits have been recognized by every single culture, and there are literally thousands and thousands of different names for them. Fairies, elves, goblins, the trolls of Scandinavia, the leprechauns and little people of Ireland, the jinns, these spirits of the North African desert. In the Hindu pantheon alone, there are 330 million separate types of spirits. And they're found everywhere. The Australian people, Aborigines, call them Wangina, while many of the Native American tribes of people often describe them as star people, suggesting that they came from some source beyond this earth. So until a couple of hundred years ago, they were recognized by significant numbers of people as being entirely real and not just fictitious imaginings, which is what they're largely thought of as today. So they're regarded just as inventions of our ancestors, and that they're purely imaginary. They're just fanciful creations of folklore, myth, and legend. I mean, if you start telling people that there are fairies at the bottom of their gardens, then they might regard you as a case for immediate psychiatric treatment. And it doesn't sit very well alongside our world of technology and brutal logic and still largely mechanistic explanations of ourselves and the universe. In the days when we were much more closely connected and in touch with nature, many more people could perceive these nature spirits and devas, even though they're not very easy to detect with our very, very limited 5 physical senses. And let's not forget that the human eye can see only less than 1% of the electromagnetic visible spectrum. So this idea that seeing is believing, we know as theosophists, is a very short-sighted, excuse the pun, way of looking at it. And we have to rely on deeper things to do this. And this is because these entities operate at levels which are not immediately accessible to us, the etheric, the astral, and the mental levels. And another problem has been that all this industrialization over the past 250 years has tended to make the human mind even more materialistic than it already was. Now, virtually everywhere you go in the world, apart from the remotest places, there's artificial lighting. The whole world is suffused with electromagnetic radiation, which may or may not interfere with the activities of these entities. So because of all this electric lighting, few people experience what our ancestors did of walking through a dark wood at night, which could have been an extremely frightening experience when there was no infrastructure of roads and just tracks through wooded places. So now very few people actually undergo these kinds of experiences. And they don't see the existence of these spirits in dark forests with only the moon for illumination. Because most people now live in bustling towns and cities without, as I say, a close connection to the natural world. And we also live in this age of ultra cynicism, where logic has overtaken magic, and the non-physical realms are denied and indeed derided by many people who will only accept what they can see, hear, smell, taste, or touch. In fact, we've got to the situation where really only a relatively small number of people can readily access these realms. And these are people with clairvoyant or clairaudient abilities or some other psychic faculties. And these people are very much in a minority. However, and this is an important point to stress, people do commune unconsciously with devas and with nature spirits when they're in woods, when they're in their gardens, when they're on beaches or walking on mountaintops or going through forests or indeed other places of beauty. And these entities also exist in towns and cities as well. They're not just purely of the countryside, they exist everywhere. And there's another important factor which banished these spirits from popular consciousness, because from the Middle Ages onwards, the Catholic Church and all its supporters and successors basically went to war against them. They cynically transformed these elemental kingdoms into demon realms controlled by Satan or by Lucifer or by the devil. And they declared this a wicked and forbidden kingdom. And not only that, they condemned those who perceived or even communed with these entities and cast them out as witches or sorcerers or necromancers and devil worshippers, and dealt with them accordingly in torture chambers or by brutally executing them. The church, of course, still believed in the angelic presences, but insisted that these supposedly lower orders were not doing what they said was God's work. Let's have a little bit of a look at some of the characteristics of nature spirits. To repeat, they appear in all mythology, legend, folklore, myth, and children's stories as well, which are replete with accounts of elemental beings of all kinds. They feature prominently in Hinduism, as we've said, Greek, Chinese, Egyptian, Celtic, African, Native American, and many other traditions as well. Many of the nature spirits are very local, just operating in small geographical areas, and not just from country to country. So they seem to have two forms in which they operate: a permanent astral body, and then a temporary materialized etheric body. And this is when they're seen, people who have the rudiments of etheric vision, and more people do these days, and sometimes they're able to perceive these. The nature spirits and elementals are affected by human thought, and especially by emotion. And they're often pictured, and so are the Devas, with what appear to be wings. This is why in the Christian tradition, angels are often appear as having wings, but these are not wings at all, not meant to fly. They're more energetic emanations coming from these spirits. Now, it's well known, and the literature, when you research it, is full of stories about this, about how some nature spirits may be quite hostile to humans because we've systematically waged war on nature in the mistaken belief that we can conquer nature, not realizing that it's the other way around, that nature can conquer us, but we can't conquer nature. It's possible that entities such as the sylphs of the air may have been severely disrupted by pollution or electromagnetic radiation, or the many thermonuclear explosions that we've carried out, as well as general warfare over the last few decades. The gnomes of the earth may resent many mining and mineral extraction activities. In fact, many miners have actually reported seeing entities deep down in the mines, and there are many stories about this. The undines and other spirits of the rivers and the lakes and the oceans have also faced their own pollution and what we would call the denaturization of water. And the salamanders of fire are evident in such things as volcanoes, wildfires, and heat waves. One interesting thing which shows that they are somewhat hostile to human beings is that, particularly in the English and Irish and Scottish tales of these, there are many stories of them abducting children and doing other things to disrupt crops and playing tricks on people. And victims are often taken into some kind of underground location where they believe that they've been for a year. And when they finally emerge, it's only one night. There are many stories along these lines. So they're often portrayed as mischievous tricksters who are somewhat hostile, or some classes are somewhat hostile to humans. And indeed, some elementals are very dangerous indeed. And these would include those elementals which are artificially created for various kinds of magical ceremonies, usually black magic ceremonies. Some of these that were created in the past, it's said, particularly during Atlantean times, for very powerful rituals then, are still said to be lingering around on the astral plane because they were created with such potency, and the more potency you put into their creation, the longer lasting they'll be. Another key factor which is quite interesting about these nature spirits and elementals is that they do seem to have a capacity to cause obsession in people. And recently, I think it was Barry Thompson who sent me this, and I'm very grateful to him. He sent me a copy of the 1920 Blavatsky lecture to the Theosophical Society called Nature Spirits and the Spirits of Elements. And the speaker was a gentleman called D.N. Dunlop. And he observed in his lecture that nature spirits don't only obsess human beings and animals, but also such things as trees and pools, lakes, stones, and mountains. But interestingly, even 100 years ago, he observed that they could also obsess machines. Now, this is quite interesting. Given the ubiquity of various forms of rapidly changing technology in the modern world, as well as all the electromagnetic energy which suffuses every part of the planet, there might also possibly exist machine entities. Perhaps we as human beings have helped to create them, artificially create these machine entities. And their home aren't the woods or the mountains or the bodies of animals, but in silicon chips and circuit boards, or even electrical musical instruments. I mean, they might occupy our smartphones, computers, and even our cars as well, because cars are very complicated machines these days. And given that these entities respond so vehemently to emotion, might it explain why our cars won't start or our laptops go wrong when we get into a negative or angry mood? I'm just suggesting this as a possibility. This is not something that the Theosophical Society would necessarily say. And so, along with the internet and all the rest of the digital infrastructure that we've created, from satellites to the sockets in our houses, we may well have created an entire new class of machine spirits. We'll move on to the Devas and the angels. As I said earlier on, these are a much more advanced evolutionary stream and loosely correspond to the 9 classes of angels recognized by Christian theology. These are the seraphim, the fiery ones, the cherubim, which are said to be closest to God, the thrones, which are the keepers of the celestial records, the dominions, which act as God's chariot and dispenser of justice, the virtues, who are essentially the middle management of the angelic kingdom, the powers, who are in charge of maintaining the natural world, the principalities, who are the border guards between heaven and earth, and then archangels and angels. Interestingly, the Hebrews used the word Elohim, both in the singular and plural, to denote both a monotheistic God and also a system of polytheism where there were more than one God. So this is somewhat confusing, but in the Hebrew texts, in Hebrew Bible, the word Elohim appears more than 2,500 times. And you'll recall at the start of the Bible, it says, God created the world, singular, but the word could just as easily be God's created the world. And of course, they do have their equivalents, the angels and devas, in all other religions virtually. And they operate everywhere. The devas operate everywhere from very local levels, junior devas, to mighty ones which preside over huge tracts of land. And they may even operate on a planetary, should they do, and interplanetary scale, and even interstellar realms as well. So if we take something like a mountain, it might have an overall presiding deva, which is larger than the mountain itself, and then numerous lesser devas controlling different aspects or parts of that mountains. Towns and cities have their own devas, and so do countries, planets, and solar systems. And their work continues ceaselessly and largely invisibly. And devas have an effect not just on the outward world, but also on the minds of individuals, as well as humanity's collective consciousness as well. We might ask ourselves, why are so many millions of people around the world instinctively drawn to places like beaches? Well, the outward reason is that we all perhaps like swimming or sunbathing or getting a suntan before we go back to wherever it is we normally live. But I think there are much deeper esoteric reasons for this attraction that people have. Because if you think about it, a beach has all the 4 elements there. I mean, there's the earth spirits of the beach itself, there are the undines and devas of the sea, there are the sylphs of the air, often manifesting as breezes or shifting clouds, and we have the salamanders of fire operating in places where there is most sunlight. So instinctively, intuitively, and unconsciously, many people are naturally drawn to these places where they exist. But probably without knowing why. So when people are in their gardens, or that they are attracted by the devas and the nature spirits of the flowers, when they're visiting lakes or the ocean or rivers or streams, they'll see the appropriate entities there, as they will in forests when they walk through the woodland. So people are in unconscious contact with these spirits of the mountains, for example, when they go hill walking. And they do it, they enjoy it, but in most cases, they don't really know why. Let's look at some of the characteristics of devas. Well, obviously, they don't have solid physical bodies, and nor do the nature spirits either. Devas tend to be about knowing and being, but our knowledge of them is largely intuitive. It's not often that we can actually see them. As I said earlier on, they are non-human. They're a separate strand of evolution, but some are said to incarnate in human form in order to be close to those with whom they're in love, with whom they have closest contact with. Devas don't die. They don't go through the usual physical cycle of reincarnation in the way that we do, but they evolve gradually from smaller devas into larger ones, and they take on much more demanding and complex tasks. The devas are also said to be the direct agents of the law of karma via a group of entities known as the Lipika, or the scribes, or the lords of karma. And they intervene and take action when human beings cause changes which are incompatible with a particular cycle of their existence. Not long ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, NASA released a picture which showed the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and it showed this gigantic thing which must have been millions of miles long, which looked like a giant angel. I don't know whether any of you have seen this picture, but it is readily available. And it was deva-like with wings and stretched for a vast distance. NASA never particularly commented on what this was. The devas could also be linked to the Earth's energy networks, of which there are several, and they might link sacred sites of power, such as the pyramids, Stonehenge, and Machu Picchu, and numerous other places, many of which are located on this world energy grid. Nature spirits and the devas may also be involved in the lesser networks of things such as ley lines and geophysical networks within the Earth itself. Okay, now the devas, we find them, as we said, in gardens and woodlands, hills, mountains, but they're also attached to particular species of plants, different types of animals. They might be particularly preponderant at places where there are streams and rivers, waterfalls, and other outstanding features of the landscape. But you'll also find them in places of devotion or meditation. Their presence will be felt in temples, in churches, in mosques, or any place where people gather for some sort of spiritual activity. And I think this is one of their very, very important functions. Each city will have its own deva, and their job is one which is essentially energetic. It's there to ensure the inflow of prana energy, this energy that comes from the sun at dawn. They're there also to protect and provide an aura for other devas. They're there to oversee the spiritual aspirants of that city, and they also provide a communications network and a link to other cities. Each of our homes probably has a household angel, spirits of the hearth, as they tend to be known. There are specialist devas who preside over places of government, of administration, and places like courts of law. They assist also, interestingly, in what is sometimes called the synchronicity of research. Throughout history, there have been many, many cases where more than one individual has come up with the same kind of scientific discovery, more or less at the same time. And this is often quite difficult to explain. Mr. Mercedes and Mr. Benz were both developing the internal combustion engine, unbeknown to each other, living only a few miles apart in Germany. And there are numerous other advances like this which have taken place where there has been a kind of synchronicity. So this overshadowing is an interesting aspect as well. And then obviously one of the groups of angels that people talk about most are what we would call guardian angels. And they may be attached to individuals, I'm sure they are, and they may also be attached to different collectives of individuals, to different groups. And these guardian angels probably are responsible for helping people with their spiritual growth and development, but also for such things as helping the flow of energy during rituals or devotional activities. And then there is a large group of Devas who occupy a place in healing. They overshadow hospitals or places where medical treatment is carried out. So, more than a century ago, the second generation theosophist Charles Leadbeater suggested that one of the key priorities in the new Aquarian age would be closer recognition, closer communication, and closer cooperation with the Devic realms. Now, he didn't say all that much about the precise mechanics of this or present any kind of timescale, but he did strongly suggest that this would become a reality. And he also said that this would probably correspond to an increasing externalization of that hidden hierarchy of advanced individuals whom we call the masters of wisdom, who guide this planet. Now, obviously, closer cooperation and communication with these Devic kingdoms is very difficult, particularly since the vast majority of people, certainly in the West, don't believe in these entities in the first place. And that is going to be a major obstacle. And I'm sure that there is resentment at the way that human beings have behaved and exploited and abused and polluted this host planet in every way that you can imagine. Not just in the obvious physical ways either, but also mentally and astrally as well, because each of our individual astral and our emotions and thoughts, our astral and mental emanations, all feed into the collective astral body of the earth and mental body of the earth. We all contribute to that. And these things, from the Devic point of view, I'm sure are as polluting as carbon emissions or oceans choked up with plastic waste. However, maybe it is only via a closer association with the Devas and the nature spirits which can help heal this world of ours and save us from what may be a potential collapse. They may be our most crucial allies, but they're an invisible army, and you can't use an army when you don't admit that it exists. So any meaningful cooperation with this secret commonwealth, if we might call it that, is going to be difficult, and by definition is probably going to involve only relatively small numbers of human beings who are sympathetic towards these classes of entities and knowledgeable about their existence and about their powers. So it's going to require quite exceptional individuals to do this. But I suspect, and I say this often, despite everything that's going on in the world, human beings are undergoing a spiritual uplift at the moment. It's hard to detect, I know, often in the horrors of the outward world, but this is taking place. And it may be that children coming into incarnation now and in the not too distant future may have much more developed faculties, particularly that sixth principle that we talk so often about in theosophy, the Buddhic principle, the love wisdom, the wisdom intuition principle. And many people now are starting to trust much more in their intuition than they ever did in the past. Now, we've mentioned earlier on a little bit about extraterrestrials. It's something that I find very fascinating and watch a great many of these documentaries on the television about Roswell and other things. I won't say too much about this, other than it would seem that, you know, even in theosophy, we talk about this planet having received external help in the past from such entities as the Lords of the Flame from Venus, or from the solar and lunar Petries. Petries is a word meaning ancestors. So there may be some conflation between what people perceive coming from another world and what is perceived in this one. It may be that this is something which creates a great deal of interest in the not too distant future. In the past, in the early days of the Theosophical Society, in the early part of the 20th century, there was much more interest in this particular area. And there have been a number of prominent theosophists who've apparently had the clairvoyant faculty to observe both nature spirits and angels or devas at work. One of the most well-known is a wonderful woman called Dora Van Gelder. And she wrote a book called The Real World of Fairies, which offers a really fascinating description of the different types of nature spirits. Dora Van Gelder grew up in Java in Indonesia. I think her father was a planter there. And as a child, she had the ability to commune with these various nature spirits. And this continued throughout her life after she moved from Indonesia and started to live in the United States. And her book is interesting because it offers very detailed descriptions of the different classes of fairies, as well as their behavior and how they influence the natural world, principally through vibrations. Also in the 20th century, British theosophists Edward Gardner and Geoffrey Hodgson also wrote extensively about this. And Geoffrey Hodgson, like Dora Van Gelder, he had wonderful clairvoyant abilities, and he offers highly detailed descriptions of both these classes. And he conducted extensive clairvoyant investigations into nature spirits, especially, and devas. He came from Lancashire originally and wound up in Australia eventually. And there are many of his books describe what he saw in particular woodlands and particular fields, and they're very, very descriptive. And what he tried to do was to communicate this to certainly one and possibly more artists who tried to reproduce what he saw. Now, what was also very interesting, in 1929, Hodgson carried out an experiment to clairvoyantly investigate how devas and nature spirits work on an embryo and a fetus in the mother's womb, building a physical, etheric, astral, and mental body. And it gives a fascinating insight into the process of rebirth. So in his book, The Miracle of Birth, he shows some of the deep esoteric processes involved in the formation and the growth of a baby. So he said this was not some kind of automatic or mechanical process, and it involved the work of both elementals and higher angelic devas. He said that at the moment of conception, there was essentially a flash of light which descended from the ego, the highest spiritual level and provided the creative impulse and the energy and the power for the processes which followed. And the combination of the positive and negative forces from the sperm and the ovum attracted a flow of force from the astral plane. And he observed a particular woman at the 4th month of pregnancy. He described the mental body as something like an ovoid bubble with delicate shades of yellow, green, rose, blue, and violet in rapid motion. And he detected a shadowy human form within that bubble. And there was continuous interaction between this mental body and that of the mother. And Hodgson also said that he detected various angels or devas seen nearby, with one overseeing the construction of all 3 bodies, mental, emotional, and physical. And interestingly, he said in the angel's aura, he saw some of the past personalities of that incarnating ego, and grouped around them were other men and women with whom karmic bonds had been formed in other lives. And he observed that the angel in charge of creating the emotional body was trying to provide the best possible astral vehicle for that child as far as karmic and environmental circumstances would allow. And this was effectively part of the mother's astral body. And there was a stream of energy entering the top of that astral body and remaining in the head. By the 5th month, he observed many different streams of force converging on the physical body with intense activity by the nature spirits at the physical, etheric, and astral levels. And the fetus appeared to act as a magnet for all these forces coming in. By the 7th month, he saw a big increase in activity and all the processes speeding up, with the ego emitting more energy into the embryo. And the focus of consciousness had moved through the mental body into the astral and then the etheric. And he described the connection between the ego and the embryo as almost like a shaft of light. He said the mental body had now enlarged to around 4 feet high and was brighter and denser than a month earlier. He described it as like snow refracting bright sunlight. By this time, the astral body of the child occupied a space from the mother's shoulder to her knee, and the astral child was in a dream state, stirring occasionally with impulses from the ego. And the baby's physical body seemed to act as an anchor for the ego with a stabilizing effect on the other bodies. And by the 8th month, this had speeded up again. And by this time, in the weeks before birth, Hodgson said that the astral angel was closely associated with the baby's body, and half of it was actually enclosed within the angel's aura. The angel appeared to be taking the greatest care of the baby, watching closely over it and protecting it from external influences. And then immediately before birth, something else happens, and Hodgson said that the various angels departed to be replaced by that of an even more lofty and potent entity whom he called Our Lady. And this, he said, was the personification of the feminine principle, recognized as Venus or Mary or Isis or Ishtar. Well, we're getting close to the end now, and I just mention a couple of things. Firstly, about my own interest in these things. And it's perhaps synchronous, perhaps accidental, I don't know, but I grew up in a village in Yorkshire called Cottingly. Now, some of you may be aware that Cottingly is famous for one of the most celebrated fairy sightings of the 20th century, the Cottingly Fairies. And this all happened at the end of the First World War in 1917, when 2 young cousins, Elsie Wright and Francis Griffiths, they lived in the village, which was much smaller than it is today. And they borrowed a camera and initially took 2 pictures of what they claimed were fairy folk near a small stream which ran close to the house where they lived. And this caused a minor sensation at the time, and the writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was interested in all these kinds of things, came across them, and he published something in the Strand magazine. The Theosophical Society also got involved in this, and 2 people we mentioned earlier on, Edward Gardner and Geoffrey Hodson, went to Cottingley to investigate. 3 years later, in 1920, the girls took 3 further photographs. Now, at the time, these images were tested by experts and they were deemed to be authentic, but they weren't universally accepted by people, and many people were entirely skeptical about them. But when Hodson visited Cottingley and did his own clairvoyant observations, he too perceived these fairy figures just the way the girls had described them and photographed them. As a young boy, they had a copy of this book in my local library, and I used to look at these photographs in this book, and I was deeply skeptical about their authenticity. Anyway, after 1920, after the early 1920s, the story goes very quiet for a few decades. But finally, in 1983, when Elsie and Frances were old women, they admitted that 4 out of the 5 photographs that they'd taken were fakes. And what they'd done is they used cutouts from a popular girls' book at the time called Princess Mary's Gift Book, published in 1914, and just stuck them against the tree. But they insisted, and they absolutely insisted, that the 5th picture they took, which was of a creature entity behind some branches, was genuine. And they said they'd only staged and faked these pictures in order to illustrate what they'd actually seen. So just to conclude very briefly, just a little note about how we might be able to more readily perceive these nature spirits, especially, and possibly the Devas. As I say, it's very difficult for people without particular faculties to do this. But that's not to say that we can't perceive them at all. I've already suggested many people are aware of them without consciously necessarily knowing it. And perhaps others have a more intuitive connection with these hidden worlds. Probably anyone who's intuitively drawn to the natural world in one way or another may have some deep unconscious inkling that these entities exist. Sometimes people can hear the sounds of nature spirits when they walk through a wood, and they might hear a breeze in the trees or a tinkling stream, or they might become apparent through the scent of a flower, or the feeling of touching something unknown when you're walking through dense woodland or a dark forest. Now, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I am a reasonably sensitive person. And sometimes when I'm sitting in my garden, I can actually feel these things. I only have a very small cottage garden. On those very few days each year, which we call summer, when I'm sitting out there and looking at the flowers in my collection of miniature trees, you definitely get the feeling that something is at work on them. So I can somehow sense that they're there. And I can also sense a purpose in what they're doing. Now, animals often tend to be much more sensitive to these things than human beings. And my cat, Electra, she's very sensitive to these things. And I often see her staring somewhere in the house or in the garden at something that I can't see, but she quite clearly can, because she's following it around, and it's not a mouse or a rat. It's definitely something that's usually floating around on the ceiling. And sometimes she watches these for many minutes, and clearly she has a perception which I don't. So, because few people have astral vision, it's very difficult, but I think more and more people are developing what we might call etheric vision. The etheric spectrum is another part of the physical spectrum of much more refined matter. Each of our bodies has an etheric body, an energy body. And sometimes you can actually see etheric things. If you are out on a bright sunny day where there are very few clouds in the blue sky, if you stand with your back to the sun, sometimes you can see little wisps of almost smoke-like stuff floating through the air. And this is probably the most dense of the etheric levels, which I'm able to see. But other people I've spoken to within the Theosophical Society and other groups as well also say that they can see this. So once we have developed a bit further, once we release the mighty power of our imaginations and our intuitions especially, we can use all this as a very potent force for good in the world. But we do need to some extent to free ourselves from the shackles of the rational lower mind, because this has kept us in imprisonment of one sort. I mean, it's been very, very useful for us, but it's also kept us imprisoned for a very long time. And we need to let our imaginations go and rediscover our intuition. It's coming up to 7 o'clock. I think I've spoken far too much, but thank you very, very much indeed for listening. And I hope there's something there of interest for you. If you're interested, a version of this talk will be published in Hermes Risen magazine tomorrow or Tuesday, and it encapsulates most of the areas that I've covered this evening. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to attempt to answer them, but I'm not sure whether I'll be able to do that or not. That depends on your question. So thank you very much again for listening. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.